Hi, I'm Benjamin Studebaker, and this is Political Theory 101. So today on Political Theory 101, we've got Chris Cutrone back. He's been on the show once before to talk about his work and his recently published books on Marxism. Today, we've got him on to talk about a Sublation Magazine piece that he recently published called Socialist Unity. And I think this is a particularly interesting intervention because it includes a call to action, and a call to action that's very long-term and big picture. It's not some kind of immediate what opinion or attitude you should have to this or that news item piece. But it does include an attempt to get people to do something that if they agreed to do it would radically restructure their lives. So that's the kind of thing that I tend to be interested in, these kind of big picture form of life questions. So I think the piece is interesting, and I want to start by asking, why did you choose to write this piece now? And what would you say is the kind of basic motivation of it for you?
I was solicited to write this essay by new people on the Sublation editorial in the spring. And then I only got around to writing it over the summer when I had some time, because I had other writing commitments in the meantime. But I had my basic thesis already back then. So there's a way that it's related to my campaign for a socialist party. So I kind of had an ambivalence about it. Namely that I thought, well, I don't know that the project I'm engaged in is amenable to a kind of manifesto treatment or a kind of verbal representation or a kind of an argument. And that I had to be careful in terms of misrepresenting it, because there are pitfalls there. And so I hesitated also and thought about it, but my basic thesis was, what would it mean to call people to collaborate in my campaign for a socialist party? It was also, I was going to take it as an opportunity to republish the original 11 theses for the campaign for a socialist party, drafted back in 2016, about a year into that project. So it's also, it's been 10 years since I launched the campaign for a socialist party in 2015. And also after the Trump election, after, which I was pretty sure was going to be the case, like last summer, I think when we were attending the conventions together at the RNC and the DNC, I mentioned to you that I was being approached by various millennial left kind of intellectuals who were kind of coming around to me or warming up to me or sort of breaking the boycott on me, if you will. And really what they were coming to me with was, what should we do? Right? And I actually do have something to say about that. But so there's the moment, but then it's also a kind of perennial thing. This is something that I think the required action that I'm calling people to do is something that's been the case for a very long time. So I like to joke with people in the campaign that I could have told them this 30 years ago. Right? So basically in the mid-90s, I could have said, this is what needs to be done, because I had already had enough experience on the left at that point to realize what the missing piece was. So that was my kind of general motivation for it. The Trump election, the sort of getting over the shock of the Trump election. I think the midway through the Biden administration, people on the millennial left were realizing, look, this ain't working. Meaning the kind of DSA, Jacobin, Bhaskar Sankara, Biden our time. That was the name of one of their issues that they released early in the Biden administration. I think post-COVID, a lot of people thought COVID had opened their eyes to things in a certain way and had clarified things for them in a strange way. And somehow my voice started resonating in their heads when they had this revelation about the reality of the world via COVID. But also I think, the sort of Bernie squad electoral path had been exhausted, through 2018, 2020, 2022. So I think it's sort of post-midterm Biden, the sort of expansion of the squad had reached a certain kind of limit, and the point of the squad had also reached a certain limit. So I would say that people started coming around, 2022, early 2023, and I was trying to kind of direct them into the campaign for a socialist party, which had been on the back burner for a number of years, only because COVID had dealt a real blow to civil social organizing. And so it's taken us some time to recover from that. Things that we had underway prior to COVID were kind of suspended, and then it took some time to re-engage. So, but again, the Trump election, I was pretty sure Trump would be elected, and so I knew that we'd be in this position this year. And I wanted to, kind of lay the groundwork. And insofar as it's not just a series of personal communications with people, phone calls with people, private conversations with people, could there be something more sort of concisely formulated in writing? And as far as its public character, like I said, I was solicited to write it. I have some ambivalence about that, and it's not really meant to be dealt with at the level of discussion in terms of writing, like written responses. It's not really inviting that, and it's not meant to be processed that way, because it's not like an argument to be further honed and clarified through written exchange. All right, so it's a peculiar kind of piece. And, I know that it's coming from me. I have a very developed sense now of what it means for me to write something in the public sphere on the left, especially mid-2025, after I've had this comment earlier this year. I sort of knew, okay, coming from me, how is this going to sound? Now, as it turns out, incidental with the resuscitation of this kind of Bernieism with the Zoran Mandami campaign, but that was not motivating it at all. It's completely independent of that.
Okay. So a couple of things stand out to me here. One is that this is an intervention that in principle could have been made by you at any point in the last 30 years, which implies that there is a sense in which you think that this position has been consistently applicable, but also a sense in which historical time has not been suited to it. And perhaps now you talk about an exhaustion of other things people could do, a dissolving of obstacles to doing this. So there is a reason why now you think it might be persuasive in a way that it wouldn't have been 10 years ago, 20 years ago, 30 years ago. So there's something about now, and you talked a little bit about COVID as being a factor in this, a bit about the failure of the Bernie Sanders campaign, and some of that is in the piece. I want to give the audience a sense of what the intervention is and what does distinguish it substantively from something like the position of Mamdani. So what stood out to me in looking through it, you make the case that socialists need to collaborate on anything and everything that empowers the working class, socially, economically, politically. Empowering, you say, means building up and developing the working class's capacity to act independently as a working class. You suggest that this involves defending the rights the workers assert. Of course, it also involves making the workers independent of capitalism. So you say that public welfare benefits are therefore the concern of capitalists, not socialists. Of course, you also say that at the present moment, the workers do rely on capitalism, and therefore those who want to be socialists haven't yet succeeded in living up to that title. They are capitalist politicians. So I think this raises a question about cases in which the workers assert rights that it seems can only be defended through state action, like the right to health care, the right to education, or the right to housing. The forms these rights take seems to be shaped by already existing relationships of dependence between workers and capitalism and between workers and the state, relationships which you acknowledge. You suggest, however, that a contradiction can be brought about such that this ceases to be the case. And I think one of the big questions that millennials will have here in particular is whether this contradiction can be brought about without rejecting these rights.
Okay, so I would say there was a progressive capitalist Democratic Party argument going back to the Obama administration. Healthcare is not a good, it's a right. The inversion of the right-wing argument. The Republican argument is healthcare is not a right, it's a good. Right? And so goods are best distributed as commodities rather than as government benefits. Right? So I would agree with the Republicans. Healthcare is not a right, it's a good.
So this is, I think, a tough one here.
Yeah.
If you're talking about socialist unity and you're trying to bring together, as you say in the piece, the activists who have been involved in all kinds of left organizing, a lot of them certainly don't think that and would argue that that involves rejecting a right that workers have attempted to defend or espouse.
Well, let's unpack it a bit. So healthcare, what is healthcare? So healthcare is developed by private entity companies primarily nowadays, but other kind of biotech initiatives. It's developed also at private universities. In the United States is largely private. It's also public, but it's private. And then so it is developed as a commodity. Healthcare is developed as a commodity. And so the question is, should the government then distribute this thing that has been produced as a commodity? And that's what socialism usually means. It usually means a redistributive program. It means taking the commodities that private capitalism produces and distributing it to the public in a way that the market is unable to do.
So it seems that you think that a right and a commodity are non-overlapping, that you can't have a right to a commodity, or that you shouldn't generally have a right to a commodity. Are there exceptions? Are there cases where we ought to think that we have a right to a commodity?
I just think it's a funny way of putting it. In other words, I think that no one really means that healthcare is a right. I think that they assert that rhetorically, but they know that it's not actually true.
How do we know what we have a right to and what we don't have a right to? In the piece, you say that the rights that the workers assert continuously evolve and develop and change, and therefore have an open-ended content.
Well, rights are rights vis-a-vis something else. Right? So civil liberties, civil rights are rights vis-a-vis the government. Right? So I have a right to have the police not do certain things to me. That's a right. Do I have a right to the police helping me on the street? No.
It sounds a bit like an Isaiah Berlin distinction between something like positive liberty, negative liberty.
I mean, it could be. I don't like that, because what that does is it sort of naturalizes and hives off and sort of smuggles in a kind of civil society state distinction and turns it into a kind of ontological character of freedom, right? And I think that that's wrong, right? So it's, the modern world that we live in is a world of rights that are different from the world that came before, where there were rights and duties. Right? So in other words, I might not have a right to have the police help me on the street, but they might have a duty to help me. It might be part of their labor contract. It might also be part of their legal status when they take an oath of office. Right? They might be obligated to do certain things the way a doctor taking the Hippocratic Oath is obligated, right? And can be held liable, both civilly and maybe even criminally, for failing to help someone. But that's different from saying, I have a right to doctors helping me. No, doctors have a duty to help me. That's different.
Of course, the police are employees of the state.
They
and
are.
while doctors in the United States generally are not. And I think an NHS doctor in something like the UK would have a duty to help you. You wouldn't have a right to a particular doctor's help necessarily, but
Right.
they would have a duty, having agreed to be NHS doctors, to help the people around them. So I think
Right.
there's a way in which you could discuss an NHS doctor such that an NHS doctor's role would be roughly analogous to that of a police officer.
Right. So in NHS, let's talk about that, because people think that again, the British have secured their rights to healthcare. Not exactly. The government has taken on an obligation to provide healthcare, and private healthcare still exists for the people who can afford it. It's still a good. It's still a good. It's still a commodity. It's just that for poor people, it's a commodity distributed by the state. For rich people, it's a commodity distributed by the market.
Well, if we
It's not a
say that
right.
you have a right to something, that right might have a kind of limit. So you might have a right to a sufficient level of healthcare, but perhaps not some level of healthcare that exceeds that sufficient limit. And then you might have the state doing some kind of rationing in which it
Yeah.
determines what healthcare you have a right to versus
My
what
husband,
healthcare
who
you
you've
would buy
met,
as a
Giselle,
commodity.
from Malaysia,
Mhm.
and they have a public healthcare system. They also have a private healthcare system. And of course, if you have the money to afford it, you go to the private healthcare system. You go to the private hospital, not the public hospital. And at the private hospital, because there is a public healthcare system, the private hospital is extremely commodified, meaning they give you a menu of choices. Do you want to pay this much, or this much? And you get the best care the more you're willing to pay.
The same
This
kind of
is,
argument also applies to education, right?
yes,
So
you can go to community college for free, but you can't go to Harvard for free unless Harvard decides that they want to distribute some tuition money to you to allow you to go for free.
but also primary and secondary school.
Oh, well, surely. Oh, yeah, primary and secondary school. That's right. But I think that there's a lot of confusion involved. I think that asserting things as a right, in other words, you can have a right under a law. In other words, the government could pass a law that says we're providing free healthcare to everyone, and then people could say, okay, the law says I have this access, and so therefore you have a duty to provide me with what the law says the state has a duty to provide me. That's not a right, because that law can be changed. Rights
So
are
rights
more
are
permanent.
not dependent on the law.
No. Okay, so here's another Republican talking point. You ready?
Okay.
Rights don't come from the government, they come from God. That's
Okay.
true. That's true.
But of course, I've also heard you say that what is natural, so natural law, is something which is subject to historical time, changes, has an open-ended
Yeah.
character,
Yeah.
and therefore the rights that could be said to come from nature would also be subject to that change, right?
Well, of course, God changes his mind. It's a living God. Don't you know, Benjamin? God is
And one of the
revealing.
ways in which we figure out in, say, Catholic natural law theory, what is in accordance with the natural law is to look at patterns of behavior, what seems to work, what seems to be operable. And so if it seems to be the case that, say, a right to primary and secondary education encoded in the law seems to be efficacious from the point of view of states, then there becomes a prima facie case for suggesting it's natural in that old sense.
Yeah. But natural means historical. Meaning, God lives in history. It's not permanent. It's not right. So God is intention, and we divine that intention. We try to figure out the divine mystery. We do. So it's for all. It's not like going to be written in the Bible. The state has to, but that doesn't mean, right? A Catholic theologian still conclude God's will for the state to provide health care, even though it's not written in the Gospels. Jesus never said so, but
right. But nonetheless, it's entirely possible, in accordance with that kind of theory, to make the case that something like healthcare is now what God does want you to have.
Yeah.
as a right, or something.
I mean,
like
basically, where I'm coming from is I don't subscribe to the choice of natural or positive law. In other words, a very distinction of something that we need to understand faced with that distinction. Symptom. The division between positive and natural law in the way that we conceive of and purpose and function of the law is itself part of the problem we have to work through. So I think that both are equally invalid, and both are one-sided in their approach.
Okay, so rights also aren't to do with natural law then? Neither to do with positive law nor natural law, not really to do with law as such.
Well, there's that. There is the problem of law, depending on what we mean by law, right? So there's law, and then there's, rights. And I think that the distinction is we have rights against the law. We don't have only rights by law. We have rights against the law, meaning anything that the law is silent on, we have a right to.
Then, of course, if it becomes the case that lots of things that formerly were not encoded in the law become encoded in the law, and they become encoded in the law in many, many places, then there seems to be this prima facie case for saying that there's something about the times we're living in that gives rise to this that may be unavoidable.
Proliferation of law is a symptom of capitalism. The hyper-proliferation of law is a symptom of capitalism. We try to use the societal crisis, and therefore we should take the position that less law is better.
Then the arising of rights or claims about rights to do with healthcare or education, this would be a consequence of capitalism.
Yes.
And socialism is also a consequence of capitalism.
Yeah, socialism is a consequence of capitalism. And we have to work through capitalism. It's not as if, we do have to achieve socialism on the basis of capitalism. However, if socialism is a symptom of capitalism, it also means that there's a danger of turning socialism merely into a way of doing capitalism, as opposed to a way of overcoming capitalism on the basis of capitalism. So capitalism should be overcome on the basis of capitalism, but the danger is always inherent that socialism will simply become a way of managing capitalism. And that's what most people mean by socialism.
Yes. Though, of course, this goes both ways. You can, in an attempt to avoid this, slip into an anti-capitalist position, which, as you say in the piece, is something that you are not at all looking to do.
Right. I think I say that being anti-capitalist is like being anti-God. It's as futile because it's like being against reality.
Right. But might that to some degree then also be said of the state in the form that it takes as a consequence of capitalist development?
It is, but there's a point also to calling it the capitalist state. To recognize that the state is charged with maintaining quo and cannot be expected to overcome, because that's not what it's designed to do. I should also say that my attitude about socialism and capitalism, I don't think there are people who are socialist minded and there are people who are capitalist. I don't think there are charitable, altruistic, solidaristic people on the one hand, individualist, greedy, venal people on the other hand. I think that capitalism is about individualism and greed, and socialism is solidarity and altruism. I think capitalism is about solidarity and altruism. And socialism should also be about individualism and greed.
Right. There's also a point in the piece where you make an argument about moralisms and moralistic accounts of socialism. And you are clear to distinguish what you're doing from that, in part because you think that making moral arguments, particularly about contentious issues such as abortion, which you mentioned explicitly, that divides the working class and makes it difficult, therefore, to constitute the working class as a class. And therefore, these issues not only have to be put on a back burner, but it has to be acknowledged that it might never be possible to resolve them. Because if it's merely put on a back burner, then there might be an impulse to take it off the back burner in some moment where
Yes.
it seems convenient.
Right. In other words, a couple of levels to my argument. One would be, does the working class need to constitute itself as such? And I'm also aware of, two aspects of that. So, kind of from a Marxist analytical standpoint, that you can only really have an exchange of commodities with respect to labor power if you have collective bargaining, because of the nature of industrial capitalism. The difference between artisanal production, small-scale production, individual production, which can be either individual human beings or individual workshops, firms, etc. So in order for capitalism to be capitalism, you need a kind of collective entity, the working because from an analytic standpoint, Marxism understands capitalism to be the result of the working class collectively organizing itself. Its class struggle is what produces capitalism, in fact. It motivated revolution, etc., etc. It sort of took things to the next level beyond bourgeois society. So there's that. The other side of it, though, so if working class collective action, based on a bourgeois solidarity, like, hey, we're being collectively ripped off by this other group of people, the capitalist class. Conversely, the working class needs to constitute itself as such, as a social and political force to capitalism and to achieve socialism. Other than that, there actually is no purpose to working class collectivism, in my mind. Meaning, working class collectivism in capitalism, without the purpose of socialism, is just part of capitalism. It's like any kind of corporate activity. So labor unions are corporate entities like the investment portfolios of capitalist firms. They are capitalist entities. Labor unions are capitalist entities. They might be junior capitalist entities, and the capitalists might conjuncturally object to the forming of these other capitalist entities that, infringe on their activity, but they are capital. Like, there's nothing inherently uncapitalist about labor unionism.
So socialism is not merely being collectivist or having some kind of unity or community of people united for a purpose. It's not simply the antithesis of individualism. Indeed, you emphasize a need to defend individual rights in many cases, the rights of minorities. And in the previous appearance on the show, you talked a lot about pluralism, the importance of having a robust variety of views which are able to be fully taken up in the political sphere. Mm-hmm. So I think all of those points are important and critical. What I wonder here is, so if you think that lots of people are confused about what constitutes a right because they don't really understand how to interface with something like nature as a historically mobile thing in time. In the past, the argument was often made that to be able to know things about nature and to be able to align yourself with nature, you had to participate in certain kinds of community spaces. And I think at points in your work, you've talked about the party as potentially performing something like this role, hosting an ongoing discussion that is historically rooted, that has a memory, that's able to learn things from events that take place and so on. So it seems to me that the way in which you understand rights conflicts with the common sense position of lots of people today. Many people would say that something like a right to healthcare is a questionable thing, but they would be very inclined to think that elementary school kids have a right to be taught how to read by a state agent if necessary. And that if there isn't something like that, there seems to be no social community organization which will otherwise generate that literacy. And there seems to be a lot of discussion lately about a crisis of literacy, people wondering if we even have the kind of Enlightenment literary culture necessary for a lot of the epistemic assumptions underwriting liberalism or underwriting socialism to work.
Uh-huh.
Is that
I guess for me,
a factor
yeah.
here?
Well, no, because illiterate people have been organized as a force for socialism in the past. So I don't think so. And I would also say, in terms of education, public education, that's also something that's specific to the industrial era. So it only really took hold after the industrialization of the United States in the Gilded Age. And it was a function of children not being exploited as laborers. And it's basically free daycare, like it's childcare. That's what it is. That's what public education is. It's childcare. It serves a multiple set of purposes. It's socialization. It's kind of advanced socialization that can't take place within the family or spontaneously in society. That no longer takes place through children in the workforce, because that was a form of socialization. And so it's meant to discipline the children as well as take them off their parents' hands so that the parents can go to work, right? So when there's a teacher strike, right, the parents complain. Why? Because it interferes with their ability to go to work. It's not, oh, my children aren't learning. It's that I can't go to work, right?
Of course,
so,
more than one of these things can be true at once. The public
yes.
schools do teach a minimum level of reading, writing, and arithmetic that otherwise children are unlikely to get. They do provide a daycare function, which allows both of the parents to go to work and spend less and less time with the kids and have the kids be underloved at home and have the family be less functional. It facilitates the dysfunction in the family. And then it also, as you say, socializes the kids, gets them used to living and operating in a corporate bureaucratized space where they're petitioning an authority. So it does all of these things, and it creates a common sense that comes out of that. It would seem that's different from the common sense that would have prevailed at a time when that institution was not all over the place. And that's an institution that is all over the place.
It's broken down, though. It's broken down. And not just in the COVID era. In other words, COVID era exposed certain things. So I like to use like Trump and Trumpian talking points because they're illustrative. Meaning, we're talking about childcare and healthcare, right? So let's stick with those two. So Trump complained that the U.S. was uncompetitive on the global market against other developed countries because we don't have a nationalized public healthcare system, right? And that the U.S. could save a lot of money, save a lot of overhead by adopting what Canada and Western Europe have. So there was also the argument, there was Ivanka Trump led an initiative to sort of expand access to daycare, to childcare, right? And again, the argument being that there was something less competitive about U.S. capitalism because it lacked this benefit provided by other countries, right? It sort of put a drag on the labor market in the United States. It was an undue burden on workers, but it also meant that maybe capitalists have to pay people more so that they can afford childcare, right? And that this was, again, a distribution problem, that there was a problem with the distribution of this function that the market was not able to solve, and that nonetheless made US capitalism less competitive. So I think that those are all much more solid arguments than the idea that there's a right.
But of course, those things can be articulated together. And indeed, if it seems to be the case that in every country that has reached a certain level of development, people start thinking in this way and start instituting these kinds of policies.
So if the DSA and people like Zoran Mamdani wanted to be successful, they would argue that the policies that they're advocating would be better for US capitalism. and they'd be much better than pretending that it's somehow anti-capitalist.
And they probably do make that argument when they're in closed-door meetings with such
Of
people.
course. You mean when they're negotiating with other Democrats? And yeah, of course, absolutely they do. And occasionally, Bernie will make that argument because he's a much more sophisticated person than most people associated with him.
Yeah.
This is the argument, in fact. This is the only argument. But historically, there's a demagogue. And the demagogue is, in the same way that, I don't know, young parents might say they have a right to be indoctrinated in ideology the public school is purveying, and the bureaucrats can turn around. Actually, you don't, and actually your child has education that you would deny them. That's why I don't think that the language of right, because then people's rights against each other, and then the state is going to adjudicate how you balance these rights, the rights of the parent versus the rights.
And yet at the same time, you do say in the piece that there is this actual fracturing, that the working class doesn't exist as a class, and therefore it will take up rights in ways which make these kinds of claims that perhaps deepen or further entrench those divisions, but which also seem increasingly, looking around the world, to be unavoidable.
Maybe. I mean, again, I think that these things are best arising more spontaneously, naturally, meaning, I think that the shape of social reality has little to do with argument and policy, and more to do with people voting with their feet. Moving to go take a job somewhere, buy this, not that. Those kinds of choices are more fundamental to the actual concrete reality. And so that's really the source of people's discontents and their demands, is how that's shaping up at a ground level.
Yeah. So one of the ways in which this is taken up is immigration.
Mm-hmm.
Very large movements of people to the countries that have these kinds of public services.
Mm-hmm.
From
the U.S. less so, but right. The U.S. less so, but the U.S. even. Yes.
Yeah.
That's true.
The U.S. even, and then certainly Europe.
Right. That's right. Well, okay. So, but on the issue of immigration, for example, there is this peculiarity that pollsters find, which is that in the abstract, people will say that they're against illegal immigration. But in the concrete instance, they don't want people, their neighbors or the workers at their restaurants or stores or co-workers or what have you. They don't want the immigrants waiting for day labor jobs at the Home Depot parking lot to disappear. Right? So they don't want any illegal immigration because it's not right. You're breaking the law. In the abstract, and yes, of course, anyone who entered the country illegally should be deported. But concretely, but I don't mean X, Y, I don't mean the good illegal immigrants. I only mean the bad illegal immigrants. Right? And so that's why the view from below versus the view from above is quite different. Meaning the policy of the state doesn't really capture it, does it? The reality of illegal immigration and the function it serves.
Well, there was a time when, for instance, the Bush administration proposed combining border security with some kind of amnesty policy, which would legitimize the people in the country to make sure that they would be paid what they deserve to be paid, have the rights that they are entitled to have, and couldn't be threatened with being outed to the government as a mechanism for forcing them to accept inferior pay and conditions. But then that didn't ultimately get through our political system.
It didn't get through, and it's a question of whether the parties have more of a stake in keeping it as a political football than as a policy proposal. Meaning, Trump, the way I understand Trump on immigration, is that he naively looked from the outside and he said, oh, these parties have been talking about comprehensive immigration reform, but they haven't been able to get it done. They haven't been able to figure out the negotiation, make the deal, and I will come in as the deal maker. That's what he did in the first term. In the first 2 years in office, he tried to do comprehensive immigration reform because he thought his capacity to get this deal done and achieve what both parties claimed to want, that the problem was that the parties had gotten dysfunctional and couldn't negotiate it successfully, but he was going to provide that service for them. And then he learned the truth, which is that they actually don't want what they say that they want. Neither party wants what they say that they want.
Right. The immigration issue is instead kept as a live issue so that the companies that hire the immigrants can threaten them with deportation as a means of getting them to accept lower pay and conditions. This is actually the nebulous condition that everybody seems to want.
And nobody wants. In other words,
Right.
Everyone seems to want implicitly, but explicitly nobody wants.
Right.
Okay, so socialists, here's a good reason why socialists should steer clear of that trap, because it's a trap. It's a bottomless hole that you will never be able to get out of, because the terms are such and the conduct of the people, the actors in that are such that there is absolutely nothing that, from a socialist perspective, can be done that way. Right. And so therefore, socialists have to organize independently of any administrative policy or law. They have to do what the gangs in the churches already do with regard to illegal immigrants.
So, I think this raises the question of whether that can be done. So
What is that?
if it's possible for, in all of the different areas that are relevant, right?
Uh-huh.
So if it's possible for people to organize the primary level education, which some people attempted to do during COVID, and not just in terms of vouchers and school choice and private schools, but in terms of pods and people educating their children at home. But it was something that was disproportionately done by parents who were in a position to be able to be at home.
Yep.
And of course, COVID caused a larger part of the workforce to be able to be at home for some period of time. But of course, there was an income-related and education-related slant in terms of which part of the population had access to that versus which part didn't. So the question then is, for something like primary education, it seems to me like it would be a hard case to say, you don't have a right to primary education. You're not going to get primary education. Rather, socialists who are interested in doing some non-statified primary education would have to offer a real alternative there, such that people felt that they really could forego state-provided primary education. Nowhere in the world has that seemed to happen. No rich country has, after having adopted universal primary education, gotten rid of it and turned that over to social organizations.
Well, they privatize things. In other words, we do have a history of neoliberalism where things that were public were privatized. But I was also thinking of my own child, pre-K. Right, pre-K was offered by the religious schools for a modest fee, but subsidized. Right, so it was subsidized by the community at the church. Right, so things were too, but that gets into another matter, because again, that's a wage problem in terms of how much you have to pay teachers, employees, so what wages people make. But pre-K, because I did go to pre-K, age 3 and 4, but it was not through the public. But it was also not something that my parents could not afford, even though they were indeed in the era in which one of my father was unemployed. They still could afford to send me. in the 70s, right? Because there was a absorption of the cost by the private entity that provided it. There was a subsidization and absorption of some of the cost. There was a sort of spontaneous, the rich people pay more than the poor people do for the same thing.
Yeah. It was suggested in the UK during the austerity years by David Cameron that the big society would step in if you did enough austerity, that there would be some kind of response from society if you cut the public sector enough. What tends to happen in most of the countries, though, that do these kinds of cuts is they get a kind of enshittified public service that's worse than it was before, that the poor people who work full time and don't have time to do it themselves or to research another option, they get stuck in. And then you get this expanding upper tier system for the people whose parents have more time or at least enough time to research options and make a provision. And then we get stuck in a kind of two-tier system, which seems to bisect the workers.
Well, certainly. So I think that, again, though, the Democratic Party will make the argument that vouchers are good. School choice is not good because it depletes resources from the public school system. It makes the public school system worse. Now, of course, there are other Democrats who argue, well, we can't keep pumping money into a sinking ship, and so we have to allow this. And then those are seen as betrayers. There's the neoliberal betrayers to the Republican policy, neglecting the fact that all of that came out of an actual crisis of public education that was real. We forget that there have been and will be periodic crises of public education, and that, in fact, again, the Republicans are right, no amount of money will fix. No amount of money will fix, right? That you are pumping money into a sinking ship. And again, this would be a distribution problem. Again, David Cameron might have made an argument about the great society stepping in, the big society stepping in. I don't really care about that because what he means by that is all right, looked at from the perspective of what the working class can and should do on its own. That's a very different kind of proposition. And the moral claims it can make on the community that are not a function of the state and electoral politics and policy differences that are spun this way and that way and legally challenged in court forever, right? And become bureaucratic.
It's certainly different what the horizon is for David Cameron. When he says that society will step in, he's of course not suggesting that there will be some kind of
socialism,
ad hoc process of moving towards socialism.
Oh yeah, right.
But he is implying that certain capacities exist, certain latent capacities exist that haven't been tapped, that are there, that you have to put some pressure on to get expressed. So, and here's where I wonder if perhaps there is...
It's the tough love approach. People don't know what they're capable of until they're forced to do it.
Right, but a fine line between that and immiserating them. Because, of course, immiserating them wouldn't get the results that we're looking for. So,
no.
How do we distinguish between cases in which you are showing tough love to try to bring about the development of a latent capacity and cases in which you're looking for something you're not going to find and the people subject to that policy will be immiserated and perform even worse?
Okay, so this would be a difference that I would draw between politics and policy. So policy is what should be done, and politics is who should be doing it. Right? So the first thing that we have to understand is that capitalist politics means that we are asking the capitalist things. And we have to understand that they will do things for their own reasons. And they might respond to pressure, but they will still ultimately do things for their own reasons because it serves their interest in some way. And so the task here is not what should be done, rather who should be doing it.
Sure.
And that's the issue.
I take that point. My question is, if you want the working class or society to do things that it hasn't done for quite some time, that it's become accustomed to the state or various administrative corporate bodies doing, then there would seem to be this question of whether all of these capacities can simply be turned on like a switch. You turn off the reliance and you turn on these capacities. And if that were the case, then you could very quickly, by getting rid of some of this administrative stuff, wake up a bunch of latent capacity that you didn't know was there. But there's also this question of if you don't use a muscle for a long period of time,
it atrophies.
It atrophies. And so there's a question also about if you're trying to build up a muscle, there's certain exercises you might do in a particular sequence or order. And you wouldn't want to jump the gun and do things in the wrong order. Right. You wouldn't want to give someone with atrophied muscles too difficult a task to do at the beginning. If they were to encounter that, they might go into deep malaise and say, well, clearly I can't do anything. They might injure themselves, and they might also lose confidence. Right.
Yeah. So I agree. So we're in a very preliminary stage. It's not like the working class can step in where it is abdicating. Right? We just have to understand that whatever the state does now, it does for capitalism. Right? It's just a basic orientation. In other words, to just recognize what is and is not what we're adopting as our concern and responsibility as socialists. Well, there are others. There are progressive liberals who can advocate for state action by capitalists. Okay, there are other people who do that, who can do that, who do that already. Like that, they've dedicated their lives to that. What I'm saying is socialism, and therefore it's not what socialists should be doing. There are already NGOs, there's a whole world out there that does this, that manages social conditions, tries to ameliorate things, tries to get the capital, tries to get laws passed and policies proposed. That world exists. We need to do what is not being done. That's already being done.
But of course, what is being done has consequences on what might be done but isn't being done. So it would have to be thought in relation to.
Yeah, I'm not saying, blow up the state now. What I'm saying is it's great that these things exist such that they exist. It's fine. It's not about arguing against what exists. It's about arguing for what doesn't exist.
So it's not an argument for doing austerity to the public schools
for
purposes of creating social capacity to do that.
No, of course not. No, of course not. In other words, those things will remain in place or be taken away because of the decisions of others. It's not something that we have an opinion, but we actually don't have a choice over. We're not agents in that, and we shouldn't aspire to be. We are not and will not be.
Sure. So then what have you observed over the course of the time that you've been running this experiment? What are the things that workers are able to do in society?
Well, for instance, you brought up under COVID conditions, the pods, the small scale, like self-education thing. Well, actually, that took place in immigrant communities more than it did in non-immigrant communities. That kind of spontaneous action by people. The kind of an informal economy, we might say, took over, stepped in, right? And of course, from a legal standpoint, there are all sorts of issues of liability. So informal childcare that communities develop on their own are strictly speaking illegal. They violate all sorts of regulations. And yet, it's still done. And indeed, society depends, even though nominally it's not supposed to be done. Right? Because people don't have licenses, because facilities have not been inspected, et cetera, et cetera. That's the actual condition of the working class. That's reality. We need to embrace that. Not wait for the state to give us something that they may or may not give us.
But might the same argument be made about what workers are doing? A lot of the things that the workers are doing are about facilitating their ability to go to work. So facilitating their ability to participate in capitalism, right? Which is why, for instance, you say that trade unions trade union consciousness doesn't necessarily have socialist directionality. It might
Mhm.
involve workers organizing on the basis of their interests, but it might just be
Mhm.
a necessary seat at the table to facilitate the functioning of capitalism,
Mhm.
and that perhaps trade unions exist and are codified in the law precisely because they perform this function, at least at this particular point in time. How then do we distinguish, when we look at the activities of the workers, what is something that socialists should take up
I think that we
versus
should
not?
emphasize things in there's what we might call consumer politics versus producer politics. And I think that the field is more open to consumer politics than at the level of producer politics. Meaning I think that we actually have to create the conditions in working class communities that can support a proper labor union kind of activity. Because I think that the labor union activity, well, first of all, so workers do things all the time to organize production themselves despite management. But if you were to formally codify it, then there would immediately be an army of lawyers there to tell you why that can't be done. Right? And so, unfortunately, that army of lawyers is not only a capitalist firm, but it's also this other firm. It's called a labor union. Because that's what labor unions have become. They've become law firms whose clients are the workers, rather than whose clients are the managers, the capitalists. Right? Most of the activity of labor unions is litigation. Most of it is legal activity. And the workers do things that don't abide by the labor contract or by the formal state rules or by corporate policy. Right. So the question is, why do we need labor unions? We need labor unions when workers' self-organizing gets to the point where it starts to tread upon the prerogatives of management such that they push back, and then you need to formally organize what the workers are doing in order to be able to resist that. You need the community to recognize what the workers are doing in order for the law to ever recognize what the workers are doing. Right? So we're in a situation where it's the exact opposite, where people start with the law and they work down to society. That's not the way it works. It's got to start at the level of society and then finally be recognized in the law, because the state realizes it can't really stop this thing. And so it has to be recognized.
So that
Right.
that again tells me what not.
Mm-hmm.
But then what would be promising activity? What would be something that you'd look at and go, that's something that socialists should do? What's a positive form of life for a socialist that's an alternative to getting involved with the law and the bureaucracy?
Okay, so very simply put, there already is like a lot of NGO, like civil social organizing that's happening on the ground. So first of all, socialists have to learn how to do that. And they do have to apprentice themselves to the liberal NGOs that exist as, at least in a symbiotic relationship, perhaps just as creatures of the capitalist state and bureaucracy. And yet, there are all sorts of things that they don't do. Right? So we have to learn about what's being done and what's not being done. We also have to learn how to do things, and we have to learn to supplement the things that are already being done by developing things that are not being done already, and work from there. Meaning we have to start with, it looks like the entire social space is colonized by the state and by politically affiliated NGOs. But in fact, there's a lot that's not addressed. Right? So at a superficial level, it looks like the space is entirely occupied. But in terms of actual practical activity, there are a lot of holes, gaps. There's a lot of open field.
What would
Right.
be some of the holes and gaps that you have observed over the years?
Well, so for instance, I pointed to the spontaneously produced community childcare in the COVID moment.
Right, but that
The
was something
informal
that
economy.
emerged in the COVID moment in
Out of
response to
necessity.
COVID.
Out of
Right.
necessity.
What would be something that we
That
would see
exists already.
regardless of the pandemic?
Right.
Continuously.
Okay. So that pulled upon resources that already exist. Again, a lot of what goes on in like the black market, a lot of things that go on in the informal economy, need to be generalized. In other words, there are communities that are better at spontaneously and organically developing their activity in the informal sector, that and there are other communities that are not so good at that, right? Who just allow themselves to die off or are fully just wards of the state, right? So we have to sort of generalize the experience that exists, take it from one context and bring it into another context. So, for instance, with the deportation push that's happening, right? So, anti-deportation activism, that's an initiative that the Campaign for a Socialist Party is taking now. And basically what we're doing is learning from the very well-developed, established practices within the Latino community and bringing it to other immigrant communities that don't have such developed practices and that are more marginalized. And bringing it from urban settings that are very developed and concentrated with their resources and bring it into the suburbs where those are more lacking, right? So, but again, the first thing that we have to do as socialists is train ourselves, learn, engage social reality, find out, about these practices. But because things are actually already being done, that's one, like, just sort of immediate to mind thing. And I think that we're working with an activist here in Chicago, a longtime activist, who said that Tom Homan complained that they couldn't do the raids in Chicago as easily as elsewhere because people were too well organized to resist them here. So it's stuff that you never hear about in the media at all. Like, it's just not. It's not a sensational, commodifiable news story, right? It's not a clickbait journalism kind of thing. It's just the droll, prosaic reality of life. That's where we have to be, right? So in other words, it's a world that the socialist intelligentsia doesn't even know exists.
I see. So instead of, say, becoming an immigration lawyer and trying to fight
Yes,
deportation cases in court, what you would suggest doing is studying communities of immigrants that are good at concealing people from the state and then copying the tactics and strategies that they use for concealment.
Yes. So it's really tactical education, and also how to deal with employers. Because even though employers take advantage of the vulnerable position of their employees, they don't want their employees to be too vulnerable. In other words, employers don't want to be raided either. In fact, right?
It sounds like what you're suggesting is really a kind of re-education for people who have an overly corporatized or bureaucratized sensibility as a consequence of spending too much of life in the formal institutions of the state and those organizations that are close to the state.
Yes. Absolutely. Yes. There's an unlearning and relearning that has to go on, but there's also just contact with the reality that is lacking. And so, the default orientation that we want to be the do-gooders on behalf of the exploited and oppressed. And it's kind of like, yeah, they don't need that, right? Like that's that they and if they can get that elsewhere. Right. So it's really, in some ways, of course, with my piece, I'm throwing down the gauntlet. Like, okay, socialists, how socialist are you really? Aren't you just progressive capitalist policy people?
So another question I have here is about anarchism.
Yep. That's what crossed my mind at the same moment. Yep, go ahead.
Yeah. So sometimes you have very well organized anarchists who are able to put together social communities that are able to sustain themselves and do sometimes very impressive and cool and interesting things. But there often seems to be a lack of directionality to that organizing. So that ultimately it kind of hits a ceiling in which it provides certain goods for the people who are immediate members of the thing, but then struggles to scale beyond that or to reach beyond that.
Yeah, so because it's inhibited about immigration. Yes.
Right. There would be a kind of limit to that. You could imagine a case in which all of the immigrant groups that are threatened currently by the Trump administration's deportation policy have all learned all of the techniques, or very nearly all of the techniques. They've all become efficient in that sense.
Mm-hmm.
They've all learned to shoot threes. So once that has happened, then there would be a question of what should they do next?
Well, that's where the necessity of a higher scale organizing would present itself, right? In other words, I think that there's a practical logic that we have to engage, in which higher level organizing is properly motivated, right? Rather than starting at the level of high level organizing and trying to drill down into reality, we have to start with, is there a need for a socialist movement, let alone a socialist party? Right now, there is not. There is no need for a socialist movement or a socialist party. In the same way that I mentioned earlier, there really isn't a need for labor unions. There might be a need for labor lawyers, but there's no need for labor unions.
In the piece, you said there was a need for a socialist politics.
There is, in this sense, right? So I'm using a lot of language elastically and rhetorically.
Okay.
Meaning most people think politics is a matter of opinion and affinity anyway. And so with what affinities should socialists associate with each other? Right? That would be politics. Now that's not high politics, it's low politics. And the problem with anarchism is that generally these mutual aid societies, like, they might nominally want to serve the people, they end up only serving themselves, and they end up being subcultural affinity groups. In other words, they don't even have, they're political in the sense of in-group, out-group dynamic, in terms of like a subculture, but not in the sense of society.
Really, they're mostly operating on the basis of moral arguments. They make moral arguments to each other that they ought to ad hoc cooperate in this or that way. And there's very little of the political really that comes into it.
And really police their own community, which I don't think we should be about. In other words, I do think that...
but also do it without politics. The policing without politics means that it's ad hoc, it's on the basis of social pressure, shaming, it's often disavowed, passive-aggressive, it doesn't have any institutional character to it.
Implicit authorities. Implicit authorities, that kind of thing. So another mistake that I know from experience, from long experience on the left, is in terms of rules of comportment for socialists. I think, again, the fewer the better. But I do think that we need some, but we have to think about what their purpose is. In other words, it's not about, it's not some kind of, well, we don't want authority figures to emerge, so we're going to set rules to prevent that from ever happening. It's rather, we'll deal with that problem when it arises. In other words, we only need rules insofar as we need them, rather than establishing them a priori, which tends to kind of kill the baby in the cradle.
Yeah, I recognize that. Don't have rules where you don't need them. Don't get political before you have to. I recognize the idea there. The question I have is, of course, if you're organizing people on the basis that they have decided not to be progressive, so they've decided not to be so state-oriented, the kinds of people that you will attract will be people who will be ultimately resistant to the political at the point at which it comes out.
Is necessary. Possibly, but maybe they'll learn. In other words, maybe at first glance, they would have a distaste for such things, but ultimately they would assent to it when the necessity arose. Right. Again, it's kind of like, on paper, one is against democratic centralism. Of course, on paper, because, wait, you don't want something imposed on you, especially when you're just trying to get something off the ground. As an example, like just, that is as a kind of a bugbear. But in practice, there does arise a situation in which it's necessary. And then it becomes a reasonable proposition as opposed to a dangerous principle with unintended consequences. Right? It might remain.
In the 11 Theses, you say that you want something that's not simply a mass movement, but also is larger than a sect. And at the beginning of the Platypus anthology, Spencer Leonard has this very lovely introduction where he talks about this tendency for mass movements to produce sects and vice versa. where a terrain in between is continuously skipped over, jumped across,
Yes.
not able to be inhabited.
Yes.
And when people talk about something that happens again and again and again, I wonder if there's a reason for that or a necessity to it. And in reading that piece, I thought, isn't there a reason that they're not able to be in the space that's in between? Because it seems that the reason that people make sectarian structures is to prevent their non-state organization from just becoming an anarchist affinity group. But once you make a bunch of rules to try to stop it from being anarchist, you then chase off large numbers of people who are interested in social organizing. You become very small, and you're spending all of your time policing who can be in and who can be out, because anarchists are some of the most enthusiastic people about that kind of thing.
Yes.
Conversely, if you attempt to take too many state-facing people at the beginning, so as to check the anarchism, you then tend to get a desire for a mass movement and a desire for something which is state-facing very quickly, which then produces the other problem. And I wonder if there is a getting caught between a kind of anarchism, anti-politics, and a pro-politics, but therefore rushing tendency, which we call social democracy, or we call Stalinism. We call these different things, but it's really about an attitude to the political. And that threading that needle has been, in the kinds of societies that we've had for the last X number of years, not possible. That ultimately you either get an anarchist affinity group or you get something which tries to immediately get involved in the state.
On the left, this has been true. On the right, not so much. In other words, the right has been able to generate organic mass movements. Especially...
why is that?
Yeah.
I think part of it is that they are not so concerned with the question of who's doing it, which is a question that's very central for you, and I think understandably so. But the right doesn't care so much whether the state does things or whether society does them. It thinks that there's a sort of natural cohabitation. And it's really just fussed about achieving its ends, what it takes to be the common good, what it takes to be. So it doesn't fuss about who does what so much.
Well, that would be, there's a right and there's a right. I was thinking much more of the movement right rather than the state politics right. Because I think that maybe the one would be, okay, I'm interested in what, and then when people think of what's missing, they think a base for the Democratic Party, a base for progressive politics in this statist sense. Now, it could very well be that that's what we end up producing, that we end up producing a constituency that will be capitalist politics. That's a danger. That's an inherent danger. We can't avoid that the way the anarchists try to avoid it. Right? Because ultimately the anarchists are, anyway, a constituency of capitalist politics. They may not know it, but they are. In a variety of ways. Passively or actively. So we have to understand that we're courting the danger of producing a social base for capitalist politics. Yes. However, that danger is not immediate. Right? So therefore we can't a priori preclude it. Right? So I think that's a problem. And I think the way I understand left and right, socialist, non-socialist, socialist versus a default to capitalism. Of course, there's an opportunism on the right that we would want to avoid. And yet also we would have to engage in frankly opportunistic tactics also. In other words, we'd have to figure out what really is a matter of principle versus what is merely a tactic. And again, I think people think about this in terms of like speech policing, right? Or something like, in other words, they think a tactic is you say it this way as opposed to that way. And I'm talking about actual action. That's very different from verbal enunciation, right? So they think of it, because the left is all about messaging. So it's about, what are the slogans at the demo? That's what people think tactics are. What language do you use in a written piece? That's what people think tactics are. That's not at all. Right. So I think that tactically we'd have to be quite open and experimental. And we have to be very a priori out on principle. And that's the mistake that the anarchists make. They think there's like a way of acting in the world that is anarchist or something. No. Right? So it's completely not moral in that sense. Right? It's not like, okay, this kind of behavior is socialist versus that kind of behavior, which is not. No. Right? So that's another important point. And again, I think that people will be disabused of this on almost immediately on contact with reality. It's only insofar as socialists move in their own circles that they can have these kinds of illusions about the stakes of their behavior. Right? The stakes of personal behavior are minimal. Unless they're obviously criminal, like unless they're obviously, like immoral in a commonsensical way.
And even as you say in the piece, many criminal acts are not consequential in any kind of major sense.
That's right. So, and that's just to leave open, like the fact that there might be things that have to be done that are against the law, but that are nonetheless not immoral. Right? In other words, they might be crimes on the book, but not actually immoral. Is it immoral for a cancer patient to smoke marijuana to alleviate the effects of chemotherapy, even if on the books marijuana is illegal? Is that a crime in a moral sense, or is it only a crime in a legal sense? And does that mean that, therefore everyone should smoke marijuana all the time from as young an age as possible? No, it does not mean that. Right? So, like moral, like, and again, I feel like the working class does what it needs to do. I say that in the piece. The working class does what it needs to do to survive. A fact. In other words, that doesn't have to be advocated for. It just is the case.
I think there's a high level of consciousness at this point in lots of different places of problems with moralism. I think a lot of people, through exposure to the culture war and the effects that it had on their friends, families, workplaces, recognize an issue with moralism, and with the moral divorced from everything else, treated as its own universe.
End in itself.
Yeah. The question, I think, is the political. And part of the trouble is that there doesn't seem to be an ability to articulate what politics is apart from engaging in the representative democratic electoral forms.
Yes, that's true.
There's no other image of politics or of the political, no other concept of it. There's a kind of Schmittianism that pervades a lot of the public discourse when people try to have a conversation about what the political is.
Partisanship, especially. Right.
Or conversely, a kind of Arendtian thing in which the contradictions are not really acknowledged or fleshed out. So, on the one hand, friend-enemy distinctions, sharp conflicts with someone that you otherwise have nothing to do with, and then on the other side, an Arendtian acting in concert.
If we could only talk. If we,
deliberative, whatever.
Right.
And I tend to think about the political in terms of intractable disagreement. So it's a disagreement with somebody that you nonetheless need to act with.
Yes.
And you've got to act with them despite the fact that...
That's the socialist politics, by the way. That's what I meant by socialist politics. I would consider that to be social action, though. I would consider that to be societal and not political. Meaning, I have to work with my coworker whether or not I like him or her. Or whether we
I think it becomes political once you get to the stage of having to make a decision that the person that you're interacting with doesn't agree with. Once it reaches the stage of needing to be able to move forward despite the disagreement. So there's all sorts of cases in which you just don't talk about a disagreement, you don't litigate it, and then it stays in the terrain of the social.
Right.
But once you actually have to Yeah, a modus vivendi. But once you actually have to move forward anyway, because the circumstance demands that you move forward despite the fact that you've not been able to produce consensus or anything remotely like consensus, then you reach the stage of having to undertake a coercive act and then legitimate that act.
Well, you might struggle, fight, and then ultimately you might prevail or relent, right? You might defer.
But a lot of the time, you don't have to struggle or fight.
Right.
You just have to legitimate the coercive act. And the coercive act generates some resentment, but it's accepted because it comes within a political framework that you've managed to get the person that you intractably disagree with to sign up.
I would, again, describe that as a social framework. In other words, to go along with something that you disagree with, and then later on you're proven right in your disagreement, or you're proven wrong in your disagreement. Meaning, oh, I really didn't think that was the right thing to do, but it turned out it was the right thing to do. Right? I would consider that still to be in the realm of the social. I would consider the
that
political
results in a consensus at some stage.
At some stage.
Right.
It doesn't require it a priori. A lot of what I'm advocating for is proving through action. Authority through action. Like, in other words, efficacy. Nothing is as successful as success, and nothing is as unsuccessful as lack of success, right? So in other words, I'm interested in the practical logic of success, of successful action. Right. So
that's one of the grounds on which you can legitimate a decision. You can say you may not see how this will ultimately be efficacious, but it will be demonstrated. It will generate prosperity. It will make up peace. It will create some kind of order that didn't previously exist. It will generate a form of freedom, something
it will
that
work.
It will do.
It will work.
Right. It will work in some sense or other. Yeah. One of the ways in which you can legitimate a decision that people initially don't agree with, and they might never come around to it. It's possible they might not. But you're able to move because you're willing to take the decision despite the fact that you haven't pre-agreed. And that, to me, is where politics is.
I mean, it's also where social psychology is. In other words, I think that there's a lot that needs to be differentiated from politics per se. I mean, I think that I'd leave politics at the level of conscious, deliberate decision. And not all decisions are conscious and deliberate, nor can they be. Not all decisions are amenable to conscious deliberation.
That might involve something extra, because that involves a level of consciousness with the decision. That might be high politics.
Yeah. In other words, there's consequences and there's consequences. Meaning there are some consequences that are of concern and there are some consequences that are not of concern. So unlike the abortion issue that I raised in the piece, I basically acknowledge that people have a variety of opinions about abortion and a variety of moral stances on abortion and feelings about it. Right. So I'm aware of the fact that people who are morally very opposed to and have very bad feelings about abortion nonetheless get abortions. And then they might feel bad about it for the rest of their lives, or they might learn to live with it, or they might learn that they shouldn't have had the moral opposition to abortion that they had when they were younger. Right? And I just think we have to allow that to be the case, right? It's not like we have to make everyone feel good and morally approve of the availability, accessibility, implementation of abortion. We don't.
And conversely, sometimes it goes the other way. Sometimes people think that abortions are okay and then get one.
And then they realize,
in fact, come to feel some other way about it.
That's actually what I was thinking. I was thinking about people that I know who have had abortions and who were very gung-ho about abortion rights and then realized that there's a problem there.
Yeah. Part of why that issue is so intractable is that there isn't one proof that leads people toward a specific position. People seem to have it proved both directions.
Yeah. In other words, people are going to feel what they're going to feel about things. And, and it's that kind of agnostic attitude. And also, look, from a theoretical standpoint, I'm just aware of the fact that on the one hand, humans have practiced abortion forever. And yet it was only really criminalized in the capitalist era.
Yeah. So
It was
Leaving the
regulated,
abortion-
it was practiced and regulated, but it was criminalized in the capitalist era. And so there's something
'Cause
about it.
There's more rules that were made in more domains of life. during
Yeah,
that
there
period.
were, and but also criminalization, state, right? So in other words, the church might have said abortion was a sin, but was it a crime in the eyes of the state? Did it break a law?
In part
No.
because of the expansion of the state's enforcement capability, allowing it to take greater interest in more areas of life.
And
than
also
it
the
previously could have done.
reason that medical procedures are criminalized has as much to do with regulated medicine as it does individual behavior, right?
Right.
With the doctors, it has to do with, we don't think that it's to practice this willy-nilly, because all medical procedures are actually regulated by law, all.
Yeah.
Right there.
To take this back, though, to that central question about the political and how to not be merely moral.
Yeah.
I think the frustration
right.
is that there's a desire for the political as such, maybe not socialist politics, but just politics. And that this often results in people doing politics that aren't socialist politics because at least there's politics there.
You want a nice little here's an anecdote. From the 60s from People's Park in San Francisco. And the left there doing soapbox, wearing horn-rimmed glasses and button versus the hippies. And had the hippies and the exist in the People's Park together. And, these went to the left of, man, you're just on a power trip. Right? There's this other trip you should take. On a magic carpet ride, better than this power trip that you're on. Right? And of course, the leftists were completely offended. They were power trip. We're trying to empower the people. But of course, they were right. Like the hippies were right. The leftists were on a power trip. And socialists shouldn't be on a power trip. Right? We're about the working class having power, not ourselves. Not ourselves. In other words, we should not be motivated by a personal desire for power. Because it's just not going to work out that way.
Terms, though, that takes us back into the direction of making moral arguments.
We have to think about
part
the
of the motivation, the lack of decisions. The reason that the anarchist methods always produce some kind of reaction eventually is that they don't involve taking decisions on things. They put off decisions that need to be taken.
Or they take irresponsible decisions.
With no formal process, with no way of...
and also no good reason. In other words, they tell this girl she can't have sex with that guy. There's no good reason, right? It's not like what we were talking about where people learn to work together on the job to get something done, right? So most people think that politics means enforcing your opinion on others. And the capitalist world knows that that's not the case, but they're happy to have the public think that that's what politics is. That's been throughout my entire life. I've been aware of the fact that the capitalist politicians know that political decisions are not about enforcing opinions on others, but they're happy to encourage the public to think that that's what it is, because that's how they appeal to people at the level of voting.
And that makes it seem like it's all an opinion game.
Yes. And a power trip.
Right. But of course, that's not what it is. That's not what it is.
No.
And there's a need for what is being concealed by all of that talk.
Yes.
And the question, the frustration that I continue to have, the concern that I have about social organizing is that it will end up producing this running away from the political because of the lack of a understanding of the political going in that is sufficiently fleshed out and differentiated.
I mean, Benjamin, when it comes to, are we ready to take state power? Are you ready to the United States? Like, you're a few years away of the age limit, but when you're 35, will you be ready to be president?
I think there's serious, limits to what the nation state can do in this particular moment. We could get into the
Yes,
internationalism
there's
dynamic.
that. Yeah, there's
You know,
that. But you know what I mean, right? Like, in other words, are we ready? Are we ready to take power? No.
Well, clearly not. In part
Right.
because obviously socialists are nowhere close to it, which is itself evidence of not being ready for it.
But we could be invited. Like, Zoran Mamdani went down to Capitol Hill and he met with the congressional Democrats, and they were like, "This guy's a talent, and yeah, he should be mayor of New York because we want to cultivate, looking, well-spoken people who can get votes."
Right. But then again, the standard for what counts as politics is
he ready
the
to be mayor?
relationship to the nation state. It's
Right.
the relationship to the nation state and its democratic elections and its process of representation.
He thinks he can be mayor because he realizes that he's just going to be the face on a Democratic Party machine, that they will actually do the job for him. I mean, it turns out that's not really true, right? In other words, like, Andrew Cuomo and Eric Adams know that they have experience that is required to actually do the job of mayor, right? That won't just turn you into a feckless hack over a kind of zombie like we have with Brandon Johnson here in Chicago.
There are enormous differences between political actors who have relevant political skills and are able to operate, are good operators, skilled operators, and political actors that don't have these things, that think it's just a question of having the right opinions when you go into the job.
Right.
The question in terms of the Socialist Party, the idea of the Socialist Party, is whether there is a sufficiently developed political attitude that can be sustained across time without liquidating.
Right. And that's the thing. So I think that we need to have a sense of mission and purpose. That's why it's the Campaign for a Socialist Party. And that's why I do encourage people to get a socialist education in terms of history and, to a certain degree, theory. Although I think theory is very treacherous because it can blind you. It can kind of bias you, especially when it's not well understood, which mostly it's not, because we don't have the basis for understanding it. We don't have the reference points for the meaning. But I think that, yes, there has to be a sense of long-term mission. And that's why, it's about producing a need for a party. And then the question is, well, the only point in starting a party is to take power. And yet, the proposition of such a socialist party taking power won't immediately present itself either. And then even what taking power means won't be clear, because ultimately the SPD took power in Germany in 1918, and it didn't bring about socialism. It just brought about a co-management of the working class of capitalism, right? So these
things. This is the point about efficacy that you made earlier. There are things you can do that demonstrate efficacy, but don't necessarily lead anywhere.
That's right.
And then there is doing something that might seem to lead somewhere, but includes a great risk of discovering that you're not efficacious.
Be able to deal with that. In other words, we certainly have to be able to deal with failure, the risk of, and we have to understand the criteria of failure and success. Like, success in what sense, failure in what sense, failure in what purpose. And so that's why, to begin with, what I mentioned is that the immediate task, and it's a sorting exercise too, isn't. In other words, it is, like, insofar as it's it is put your money in the socialists. Are you serious about this? Do you really want to do this? And also do this in, people have different talents and skills and capacities. So it could be that intellectuals are only good at a kind of a journalistic effort rather than a practical organizing effort. Not everyone is suited to every task. In other words, some people can write and some people can organize people. Often the same skill set doesn't coexist within the same person, and that's okay, right? So we need a division of labor. People need to find their talents, They need to find their capacities. They need to develop skills, also be train themselves. It's going to be an experiential journey for people. And I think that the patience with that is going to be paramount. So success will be developing ourselves as socialist cadre. That's the immediate criterion of success. Meaning, can we develop these skills? Can we find our talents and develop these skills amongst ourselves? So I look at it as a whole generation of young people who seem to want to do something have been exercised over this question of socialism. Like the DSA was able, I don't know, send out thousands of people to canvass for Mamdani in the primary, right? And even though it was a small slice of the electorate that participated, but they still required thousands of people, and they were able to get thousands of people to do that. And I'm sure that they discovered talents and developed skills that they didn't know they had, and they didn't know that they needed. I'm sure that they developed skills they didn't know ahead of time that they needed, and discovered talents that they didn't know ahead of time that they had. And my sense is that this is a wasted experience, right? That the same thousands of people should have been doing something else.
And learning different skills and
Yes.
discovering different talents
Yes.
in line with those other tasks.
That's right. And some of the people are just going to be progressive capitalist canvassers and talking point marketers. And some people can do something else, right? So it will be a sorting exercise. In other words, the people who should be progressive capitalist foot soldiers, they, by all means, that's their purpose in life, is to canvass for Mamdani. But there are other people who are doing that because there's nothing else to do, because it seems like that's the only thing you can do. And what I'm here is there is something else you can do. There are all sorts of things.
So for people looking to get involved in your something else that they can do, what should they do? How should they go about that?
Well, okay, so we have minimal capacity to onboard new people, but we have some capacity to onboard. And because we are developing these new arenas of activity, like the anti-deportation action, there are things to get involved with. And so there is, there was a Facebook page, mostly inactive now, but it exists, for the campaign for the Socialist Party. And there is an email address, but in fact, off the top of my head, I don't know what it is. So I'm going to actually find that right now. But people can contact us. And we are in a number of cities in the United States. And so, for instance, we are in Chicago, but we're also in New York. And we're also in places. But, so there are possibilities for acting in local environments, but also we're trying to develop. So part of what we're trying to do now is develop an place so we can share experiences. Meaning that we actually need to be operating on different issues and in different environments in order to develop the capacities that we need. So we who are trying to organize in the suburbs versus people trying to organize in the cities, etc. Right? So we actually, like, in other words, on principle, anyone can get it. Because, the social and political issues are pervasive. They exist in every community in the United States. They do, right? For instance, on the immigration front, there are immigrant workers without papers in every single community everywhere in the United States. That's simply true. And therefore, literally everywhere in the United States is a potential site of a deportation, raid, ICE action, etc. Right? And so, now in terms of our being able to support people's activity, obviously it's better for people to be in person, on the ground, where they can work with work with us, because otherwise it might involve having to travel to get training, right? Because our capacity to travel to people is limited at this point, right? So, but there are there is a here. I promised tonight, so I will. Let me find the oops, the email address. There was an email address, but go ahead.
Got to prove efficacy.
Efficacy?
Yeah.
Okay.
Have the email address.
There's campaign for a Socialist Party USA at gmail.com. So that is easy enough. Yeah, I just wanted to make sure that I remembered all of the wording correctly. I thought that it was something like that, campaign for a Socialist Party in the United States, at USA, I should say. But I wanted to make sure about that. I mean, the other thing about this is that I'm an ambassador of goodwill with regard to this, meaning, I'm more the inspirational leader at this point than I am the practical leader. There are other people who are more practically leading the effort.
Are any of them public facing? Are any of them people that somebody
that we'd know of? About? No, tend not to be so public facing. Right, not to be so public facing. Yeah, and people are remaining anonymous. They're just not podcasts. It's not that they keep their but rather it's because this isn't the kind of thing that really about publicity. It's not about publicity. So again, a lot of what
division
people
of labor, as you were saying.
It's a division of labor, and also because I'm utilizing my public profile for this purpose. So I would say that the activity that we engage in is not at all about getting media coverage. It is not. In some ways, want media coverage. This activity, right? It's social reality, right? So again, people think that politics means a media spectacle,
and trying to
the
make
actual
power and convince people. Yeah.
But also the powers that be know that it's not a media spectacle. In other words, they know that the important decisions are not representable in public. And yet it also suits them that the public it is.
So then, Chris, why did you want to do a show where we talked about all of this?
Again, I feel that the point is to let people know that there's something that they haven't considered. That there is a reality that is invisible to them that nonetheless exists, and that there are people who are acting in that realm that they can join.
All right. Well, I think we've probably about run our course for today.
Good.
Thank you guys so much for listening, and have a wonderful rest of the day. Bye-bye.
Thanks a lot, Ben.